Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jing Su, Chair to Council on East Asian Studies. I'd like to welcome you to the 56th Edward H. Hume Memorial Lecture. This has been a long-standing tradition at Yale, and we are very much indebted to Dr. Hume's friends and family for supporting us with this very important lecture series that we have only once a year since 1960, beginning with John Fairbank, actually. Dr. Hume devoted much of his long, vigorous life to working in China and elsewhere in the cause of health care and medical training. He graduated from Yale College, one of our own, in 1897, and received his medical degree 4 years later from Johns Hopkins University. He worked in India from 1903 to 1905 before going to China, where he actually founded the Xiangyang Medical School and Hospital under the auspices of Yale in China. So this is also a very long-standing tradition at Yale. He served as the president of the College of Yale in China from 1923 to 1927. I returned to the US, but was recalled to China in 1934 and worked for several years in liaison with the Chinese National Health Administration. Shortly after his death in 1957, funds from colleagues, friends, and family enabled the establishment of this lectureship to bring to Yale eminent scholars of East Asian studies. And we've done this every year now for a few decades. But I think today we have a particularly special guest. In fact, Professor Stephen Owen is not a stranger to Yale at all. He started here 1972 as an assistant professor in 1982, a decade before he was snatched away by the institution 2 hours north. And he actually also goes even, history goes even further back than that, because Professor Owen actually received both his BA and PhD in Yale, 1968 and 1972. So essentially, he would have stayed and could have stayed. But what we are most happy about is that he is now returned to us. And I think today is a quite a remarkable occasion, because as I was reading his abstract and the title of his talk, Returning to the High Tang 35 years later, you just tweak the numbers, it could very well be Yale 35 years later. And in honor of this, I was actually looking at one of Professor Owen's first books, in fact, the first book that grew out of his dissertation here. And it was a review by James Liu in the Harvard Journal of Asiatic Studies. The most striking thing is that back then, you could have bought this book for $15, which is not really possible anymore. But the observations that Professor Liu made of this young, brilliant scholar who is destined to be a teacher to almost everyone in Chinese literary studies in the US. And he said that Mr. Owen displays considerable sensitivity to nuances of meaning, verbal subtleties, poetic devices, and stylistic traits. And he also remarked how his contribution in his mind was able to make sense, to give appreciation, understanding of the often difficult and bizarre poetry of Meng Jiao and Han Yu. Now, I would like to say that if Professor Liu were here today, I would say, little could you have expected that these became the very standards by which he judged all his students. And having been one of them, although more as an outlier than a proper student in pre-modern Chinese studies, I am sure that his famous 3-hour pre-general generals still give students nightmares and perhaps something to aspire to in the future. I actually would also like to say that Professor Owen has many dear friends and colleagues in the audience. And in many ways, I came quite late, at least on the Yale side. And I would just like to say that I think I speak for all of us, that we are so grateful in some ways, and it's actually more of a heartwarming occasion for us to have you back here and to talk about your return to the High Tang. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Stephen Owen.
Okay, am I on? Introductions are always very hard to live up to. Also, when you've lost your talk. Do you have a? Yeah. I want to thank Jing and the Council East Asian Studies, for inviting me here. Jing's talked about, I will tell you a secret about Jing. It took me a long time to persuade her not to try to write 2 dissertations. She was determined to do both the modern dissertation and the classical dissertation. I'm an old Yale. I was an undergrad, graduate student, professor. And I was at a lot of Hume lectures. I haven't been to a Hume lecture for some time, but I never imagined that I would find myself on this side of the Hume lecture, looking out at you. As some of you know, I wrote a book on the poetry of the High Tang back in 1980. That's 35 years, when I was still at Yale. And I want to return to the topic to see what looks different to me after 35 years. This is an interesting enterprise, right? Letting us think about how fields change, how we change. And I want to warn the younger scholars in the audience, right? The danger of writing a book is it has no expiration date. People still cite you, what you wrote when you're in your early 30s. You can't take it back. I suppose that's as it should be. And fortunately, I don't basically disagree with what I wrote then, but I do see things rather differently now. And what I think has changed is the map of the tradition as it now appears. In place of a relatively stable set of categories that can be used at least provisionally, the Chinese tradition now seems like a vast, fluid field of evasions, inventions, forgetting, and selective memory, which are shaped by now forgotten motives, opportunities, and accidents. What seemed clear and certain then now seems rather uncertain. This is not the way, of course, it's taught in China. In China, it's inscribed in stone, so replete with scholarly detail that graduate students are routinely directed to a very small part of the backwoods in order to write their names. But once you develop that critical twitch, I think part of my Yale training, and starts asking questions, the illusion of stability often becomes merely the trace of some later formation. And we soon begin to discover that the scholarly field is not only not complete, but I think we're just barely beginning to work on this. And in that spirit, I want to turn to a cornerstone of the received tradition, the so-called High Tang. Anyone who studies China at all has heard of the High Tang, the Sheng Tang. When you study poetry, you know this is supposed to be the high point, be the best, the grand moment. I don't know if anybody here was in the great forest age of my lecturing. But the odd thing is, if you look at the Sung reception of Tang poetry, it quickly becomes quite clear that the readers, the critics, and the poets weren't interested in the High Tang at all, quite apart from Li Bai and Du Fu, of course, and for a lesser degree with a little with Wang Wei among Haoran, but not very much. Sung poets and critics were not only disinterested in the High Tang, they were largely equally disinterested in pre-Tang, except for Tao Yuanming. They just didn't read it. And then you start looking, well, let's spot that word, Sheng Tang, High Tang. When does that first appear? It appears all through the Sung dynasty. It's the name of a county. It has nothing to do with poetry until about 1220. And it appears, where's my, gosh, there was it. Well, there goes the water. Now, I did have a mouse somewhere here. And you can't use PowerPoint without a mouse? Oh, there it is. That's great. Okay. Okay. It doesn't appear until the Canglang's poetry talks at Canglang Shihua by Yan Yu. We don't know Yan Yu's dates or the date of the Canglang Shihua, but it was probably written in the 1220s or 1230s. It's half a millennium after the Sheng Tang itself. The crazy thing about the Canglang Shihua was it was immediately influential. As soon as the book came out, it became the standard. especially from the 1240s on, largely unread poets began to be read again. People whose names were never mentioned all of a sudden appear throughout remarks on poetry. These poems began to appear in anthologies and even to dominate them. Yu not only invented this word, this is his creation, right? He not only invented this word, he made it the very center of a narrative of Chinese poetry that survived to this day. The sheer audacity of this just shakes me up. Suppose I wrote a book proclaiming that the early poetry of early reign of Henry VIII was really the high point of English poetry. You had to know, hardly anyone reads that. You have to know it really well to read Wyatt and Surrey. The Elizabethan era represents the beginning of a sad decline in the quality of English poetry, which has gone steadily downhill ever since then. Not only would I make this weird claim, but within 5 or 10 years, everybody would believe it. All the anthologies would change, and the unread poetry of Henry VIII's early reign would now dominate the study of English poetry. You might try to say, well, maybe the Romantic poets had some good 20th century poetry. Oh, no, can't be as good as that, okay? The thought of getting away with that is amazing. You might suppose that Yen Yu meant Li Bai and Du Fu when he had said High Tang. No, he doesn't mean that. If you read Yen Yu carefully, it's stranger than that. At this point, one of these things, I can move that around there. This one, I'll just explain what it says. I won't translate. He says the student should first read the famous High Tang poets, the Sheng Tang Mingjia, and only then read Li Bai and Du Fu. It's a necessary context for reading Li Bai and Du Fu. Or sometimes read Du Fu and Li Bai first, then read the High Tang poets. And somehow they're on this large, unread sphere of perfection that lies around Li Bai and Du Fu. It's at the heart of the history of Chinese poetry and the very condition by which you can read Li Bai and Du Fu. The High Tang was not simply a new period in Chinese poetry, but a narrative function, an account of classical poetry from the Han to the Song present, given not simply as literary history, but as a curriculum. He's the first person who said, read everything in chronological order. It's the study of poetry, shixue. In contrast to the earlier critic Huang Tingzhen's use of the past as a kind of open reservoir, you pick things out, you change them around, you use them in the present, Yen Yu's student had to learn the poetic past chronologically, and the largely unread poetry of the pre-Tang period was part of that curriculum. So that also got the pre-Tang, the Weijin Nanbeiqiao, back into the curriculum. Yen Yu firmly believed that everything had gone downhill after the High Tang. And in different passages, he gives different contradictory advice of what a student should do after you read up to the High Tang. Well, in one case, he says, close your book, don't read anything else. If you read anything after the High Tang, it will infect you, and the worst kind of poetry demon will enter your body. Then he gets very angry a little bit later, and he says, go ahead, read it all the way through. But if you don't see how bad poetry is after the High Tang, nobody can ever teach you anything. You're so stupid. It's a old Chinese schoolmaster. And I might add here that this literary historical narrative as a reading curriculum was probably Yen Yu's most enduring influence on the Chinese literary landscape. Before Yen Yu, poetry anthologies were often not organized chronologically. After Yen Yu, poetry anthologies are always organized chronologically to this day. So what made the High Tang so good? That's a good question. What's its most important characteristic? Its characteristic is that it has no characteristics. Poetry is to sing what is in the heart. In the stirring and excitement of their poetry, the High Tang writers were those antelopes that hang by their horns, leaving no tracks to be followed. Where they are subtle, there is a limpid and sparkling quality that can never quite be fixed and determined, like tones in the empty air or color in a face, or moonlight in the water or an image in the mirror. The words are exhausted, but the meaning is never exhausted. And this actually has to be understood in relation to the notion of fa, method, and there's nothing you can study here. This kind of perfection can only be grasped by a kind of enlightenment, using Buddhist terms, which you can reach only if you follow the entire history of Chinese poetry up to the High Tang. Now you think that when you get there, you're going to have this epiphany, you'll understand it, you'll be able to do it. But no. In Yan Yu's belated world of epigons, once the student grasps the possibility of such poetry, he'd be able to achieve only the middle level. If you actually read the middle stuff, you're only going to be the worst. And God knows what happens if you read the really bad stuff. I don't even want to think about that. Now, Yan Yu's supremely weird and melancholy poetic pedagogy, in effect, replaced the entire vision, understanding of Tang poetry as it had been to that point. You know, the song like the 9th century, like the mid-Tang and the late Tang, and Li Bai and Du Fu. It installed a new narrative, which, though revised and augmented, remains in place to this day. You can't remove the High Tang because it has a pivotal function in the story of Chinese poetry. Its success was astoundingly quick, as I said. There is a big anthology that appeared in 1244, Shi and Yixie, starts off with the basic statement on what poetry is. It starts off quoting Yan Yu. That's about 10 years later. Now, if we understand Yan Yu's intervention, and the word intervention here sounds very good, and the role of High Tang in his literary historical narrative, it frees us to return to the era and look at it in a fresh way. I think rather than an era in its own right, it may have been simply a transition, elusive for that reason, and inimitable for that reason. It is neither here nor there, between eras that do have traces and are imitable. On the one side, earlier, they have court poetry, which had strict rules of exposition, diction, conventions closely tied to topics. Now you can imitate that all over the place. On the other side, you have the highly self-conscious poetry of the mid-Tang and late Tang, which the Sung understood all too well. But in the middle, rather than an elusive pure poetry that happened in history but didn't really belong to it, that's what Yan Yu is basically saying, we may find a poetry that is indeed deeply grounded in its moment and succeeds precisely because of the validity of the moment. Now, Yan Yu really isn't talking about the High Tang poets. He's actually talking about a small group of them. He doesn't mean the courtiers, who are still very important. He doesn't mean the archaists, who are becoming very important. He means the poets of an anthology called He Yinglingji from 754. At least these are the poets that have come to define the High Tang, including Li Bai, but of course not Du Fu because he hadn't written much by 754. Most were Jinshi graduates, with Li Bai and Meng Haran being the exceptions. Almost none came from distinguished families, Wang Wei being the exception. They all, however, belonged to a network of poetic exchange. It's useful to compare this anthology with another contemporary anthology called Guo Xiuji, I didn't put that in your notes, which was a product of the Imperial Academy. Now, that Guo is Guojia de Guo, and you don't quite know how to translate it. Dynasty, capital, heartland. But if we choose one, we can call it a collection of the flower of the capital. However we translate it, the title is oriented toward the imperial center. And you open the book, you look at the table of contents, every poet is given with his office. Those who had no office become Chu Shi, recluses, or Jin Shi, which means you came to take the examination, you didn't pass. An impressive number of these people had central government offices. It's an anthology representing the capital. In contrast, He Yinglingji can be roughly translated as collection of the geniuses of the rivers and great mountains. Now, the term He is a variant on Shanhe. You all know your Du Fu Guo Po Shanhe Zai. Well, that means dynastic territory. Okay? It's what the guo has, not what the guo is. You can say guo zhi shanhe, but you can't say shanhe zhi guo. Even though Wang Wei served in the central government, the title of the anthology positions geniuses outside the capital. The anthologist, Yin Fan, was himself from Danyang, right near modern Zhenjiang, and he compiled an anthology of Danyang poets. He's talking about the poetry of the empire, not of the capital. Although the poets of the Guoxiuji were by and large not great courtiers, the two anthologies are weighted very differently, which brings us to the question, was being a jinshi very important in the Tang dynasty? The people who passed the jinshi examination said yes. The people who really held power in the Tang said yes if the person comes from a good family. But they seemed to devote their lives to making sure that nobody who was not of a good family who passed the jinshi examination rose up to the level of county sheriff. They hardly ever rose higher than the bottom of the official ladder. This is the young man from Yale who wants to work on Wall Street and make a bundle and ends up running a Bank of America branch in a small town in Arkansas. That's what passing the jinshi does. We know the Tang scholars know quite well that the jinshi graduates made up only a diminutive proportion of the empire's office holders, and those who had real power, as I said, made sure that they didn't rise any higher than the bottom. Real power in the Tang was always held by a very small group of families who intermarried and supported one another. And as Nick Tackett has just very nicely demonstrated, they belonged to the capitals. They moved the family tombs to the capitals. They are the servants of empire. If their children took the examination, remember the one thing with the Tang examination that separates it from later on? The Tang, you wrote your name on the examination. Oh, that's so-and-so's son. And they took most of the jinshi passages. They always let a few people get in from the outside, but not many. Right? So, perhaps the best way to understand the place of the jinshi in the Tang elite is go back before the High Tang to the period when the jinshi ranks opened up under Empress Wu, who was then ruling but not reigning. And Zhang Zhuo was a jinshi graduate of 675, renowned for his talent. He's the protagonist and probable author of a story, novella called Yoshenku, the Grotto of Wandering Immortals or whatever. And this is the ultimate jinshi fantasy. You take the old erotic story of the young man or men wandering in the mountains, meeting two goddesses and sleeping with them and then leaving, and you transpose it to Tang geography, Tang history, and Tang social situations, and you have this story. On his way to take up an entry-level post of county sheriff, they all had to be county sheriffs, Zhang encounters two beautiful widows in an opulent villa in the mountains. The widows identified themselves as Qinghe Cui, that is, the Cui clan of the Qinghe branch, one of the most prestigious of all families in the Tang. Unfortunately about these great families is they had kids all over the place. And after a few generations, there were more Qinghe Cuis than you could count. So being a Qinghe Cui in itself doesn't help you. What you've got to do is you have to say, who did you marry? So she proudly then makes sure that you know that each of the widows had married somebody of an equally distinguished clan who held very high offices and been conveniently killed in battle. So that's the way of saying, these are the Qinghe Cuis. Wow, right? This establishes them as the who's who of the Tang. Now, what's interesting is the opening thing where Madame Cui meets the young jinshi graduate Zhang Zhuo and treats him with utter disdain. In response, we hear for the first time, the most familiar refrain of all Jinshi not from very good families. My family was very prominent in the Han Dynasty. We held, ministerial posts for generation after generation. We fell on hard times for about 5, 6 centuries. Now we're back. Me? Right? I think every Zhang said that. Everybody has famous ancestors. Madame Sui, when she hears this, is not impressed. And the story itself is basically a long demonstration of Zhang Zhuo's verbal, cultural, and toxopholite, archery skills, finally to win the lady's lust and be invited to her bed. And this is, of course, the second successful examination that young Zhang Zhuo has been through, more rewarding than the first. It's hard not to see this story as an allegory of the new class of examination graduates, imagining that they will be accepted by the ironclad ranks of the real Tang elite. And of course, the answer is never. Now, in a later age, by the time we get to 754, these people, as I said, never rose above the level of county sheriff, at the very bottom of the ladder. But 75 years after Zhang Zhuo, they no longer had any fantasies that they ever would be accepted by the ruling class and get into it. And there's a new tone, and this may be part of understanding the poetry of the era. This is part of the agenda of Haiyu Yinglingji, seen in the very first entry on the first poet represented, Chang Jian. And it says, "They say that there are never noblemen among the greatest talents." And this is indeed true. Everybody who died in low posts who had talent, including Chang Jian, who passed away as what? As a county sheriff. Right? In Yin Fan's eyes, this is a community that by virtue of its talents was destined never to hold power and the common kind of social prestige. Although many Jinshi graduates were not particularly good at poetry, and although they were scattered in many places, I think they constituted themselves as a community outside the ruling elite, by and large through poetry, which was for them the instantiation of their talent. They often proclaimed their disinterest in prestige and power, knowing that they really wanted it. And the phrase, "Da Yi Ming," to get one name, is often used for the examination. The emperor has the power to make you a graduate, right? That's your first fame. But this community claimed the power to grant Ming apart from the imperial center. They said, "We can make you famous." And this Ming, of course, unlike the other separate spheres in the Tang, was a family name. Chang is a Gregor surname. You can rise to the top of the Sangha in Buddhism, you have to have a monk's name. If you become a very prominent Taoist, you have a Taoist style. Something, right? There had been regional groups apart from the imperial center in earlier history. I think of the Eastern Jin. But I think this is probably the best candidate you're going to find for the beginnings of an empire-wide literati. At least claiming at least partial independence of the state. The empire can give me an office, but it can't make me a good poet. I can tell you if you're a good poet, says Yin Fan. At the heart of that independence is claiming the power of authoritative judgment regarding fame, and simultaneously denying that authority to the center. The emperor can grant office and political power, but he can't successfully declare somebody as a great poet. In Yin Fan's preface, we see an interesting inversion of social political reality. If those with power saw the talented poets without family backgrounds as interlopers in a stable political system, Yin Fan imagined that those without talent but possessing status might use their authority to get into his anthology. So he says, from the Datong reign down to the Tianbao reign, nearly 1,000 have held the brush in hand, excluding the politically powerful, those who gave bribes for inclusion in an anthology. He imagined people are going to bribe you to get into his anthology. Scarcely 40% are eminent and estimable. You can't anthologize them all. So, And if a person's reputation does not match the actual situation, if their talent is not in accord with the way, that even if their power overtops that of Liang Ji and Dou Xian, Eastern Han grandees, I would never include them. You know. So Yin Fan puts himself in the role of the community's gatekeeper, keeping out the untalented but powerful member of the Tang oligarchy, and who I think in Yin Fan's imagination might seek inclusion. Reputation here is not conferred by the state, but rather by a consensus of the community that Yin Fan claims to represent. Any intrusion of state-sanctioned power in that judgment must be resisted. The great families were an urban oligarchy, and their poetic production was largely in the regions of the two capitals. If they're rusticated, they look back towards the capitals longingly. Our other community of talented poets, excluded from power, circulated in the empire outside the capitals, in the empire's mountains and rivers. In this community, we begin to see poetry used in lateral communication. Do you know what I mean by that? You're seeing poems being sent across, not to the capital and back, or from the capital, being sent across the empire to other places, other provincial places. They visited local officials, and no doubt, in gratitude for hospitality, celebrated them. It became a network of mutual recognition, completely separate from the power of the center to assign status and prestige. From local officials to temples to country gentlemen, politely called recluses, reputations circulated in poems. It's not that we don't see this earlier, but the volume of extant production and the geographical extent was unprecedented. If Chang'an Luoyang ruled the empire, this period created and culturally mapped the empire in a larger sense. For the urban oligarchy, the empire outside the capitals was a tax base, basically, a source of luxury goods. But a most unwelcome place to live. Nobody wanted to live outside Chang'an or Luoyang, unless you happen to be set as prefect of one of the really rich cities, which you can milk for all the money it's worth and come back. Our community of poets celebrated the larger empire and made it a map of places with aura. This is a real poetic investment in place. Our High Tang poets may have spent their careers moving from one provincial place to the other, but the collective consequence of that was the beginning of a tourist map of the empire. Just the one poem everybody who's read Tang poetry knows. The Yellow Crane Tower, now in Wuhan. Someone long ago already rode the white clouds away, and all that remains of this place is Yellow Crane Tower. Once the yellow crane went away, it never returned again. For 1,000 years, on the white clouds just go on and on. On the sunlit river are clearly seen the trees of Hanyang, and spring plants grow in profusion on Parrot Isle. At sundown, where is it? The pass that leads towards home. Misty waves of the river make a person sad. Oh. Well, some earlier voyager, going past Yellow Crane Tower, the boatman may have said, here's the legend, that's the place. No one would ever have known about it. But once this Sui Hao poem went into circulation, it was very popular. People would go there in order to see what Sui Hao saw. And their response becomes, oh, that's Yellow Crane Tower, right? Architecture is not very durable in China. I've decided Chinese architecture is very much like Lincoln logs. You can build wonderful things with it, but you take the pieces apart and put them up somewhere else, and it falls down. There's always going to be a Yellow Crane Tower now in Wuhan. It's been burned down and rebuilt so many times, but the poem needs a building. Because if you don't have the building, you can't say, so that's Yellow Crane Tower, right? You've read about it as a kid, now you have a place. There's also Xiangyang in modern Hubei. It had its own songs, largely forgotten until Li Bai, the voracious reader, remembered them. It had many sites and stories and geographical lore. In the 7th century, Chen Zhiang had visited and used allusions that we never see again. Nobody read his poem. Once Meng Haoran and Li Bai got there, everybody knows what Xiangyang is. It's the Duolei Bay, the stele for shedding tears. It's Zhengjiaofu and the nymphs of the Han River. It's, Pang de Gong, the recluse who flees with his family when he's threatened with serving. It's, the drunken governor, Shan Jian, with his jelly hat on upside down, coming back drunk with all the kids laughing at him and clapping their hands. Xiangyang became a place. Everybody knows it's poetry. It was transformed by poetry. If you check out the contemporary Xiangyang website, you'll find all of this there. You won't find the illusions that Chen Zhiang used. You'll find the illusions used in the High Tang poems. We see the sure durability of their publicity. We see that we begin to understand why poetic travelers were so welcomed and entertained in their peregrinations. If you live in a small city with a long history or some out-of-the-way temple in a spectacular landscape, the poet is your advertising agency. It makes you feel like this is really a nice place, right? He's a cheap hire. Give him a little food, a little drink, place to sleep for a while, maybe a little money. And from a backwater, you suddenly become a famous place in the empire. That's a good bargain. And travelers will come there just to see the place that was celebrated by Li Bai's poem or Meng Haran's poem. The temples would often set the poems up in the courtyard until the 9th century, when too many poetic travelers were coming by, and the temples were littered with poems. They put them up on wooden boards, and they took them down afterwards. But still, if you go to a lot of temples that's been celebrated, you'll find carved in metal or stone, you'll find one of those Tang poems. Right? Jiankang, Jinling, Nanjing had been burned to the ground in the Sui conquest. I suspect that the Sui orders were pretty much confined to the center of the city, not the places around it. There are a few earlier Waigu laments from the past about the place, but really, Li Bai invented Nanjing. He was the one that celebrated all of its spots, gave it all sorts of famous poems. After that, a lot of other people did. Because really, he helped create that city as what it is now. And it's not just Xiangyang, Handan with its beauties and carousing, Jibei with its gallant knight errants, the rich, somewhat anachronistic lore of the frontier. As a cultural space, judged from contemporary writings, China of 750 looked very, very different than China of 700. Because by 750, it's not just Chang'an and Luoyang. By 750, there's a whole world of China as a space. The High Tang didn't complete the map. Du Fu added Chengdu. With some predecessors, Du Mu added Yangzhou. But by the end of the Tang, there's a cultural, poetic map of the rest of China that made the empire no longer just a Rome, an immensely successful city-state, but rather it had become an imperial territory made up of many places. It was more than a map, it was a community. The poets praised one another and all those who entertained them. They celebrated a way of life beyond the emperor's reach. We can be sure that almost all of them wanted office. But failing that, they could conjure up in their poetry a way of life that was preferable. They had to talk themselves into it. They could imagine a way of life that was preferable, whose attractions were discursively realized. Okay, I'm going to skip a section here. Now, I'd like to argue that as this community forming around the composition of poetry and circulation of poetry took shape, they were thinking about empire and its limits. The easiest obvious example is their development of the older poetry of the recluse into a celebration of private life. And Du Fu left extensive documentation on a life of seeking patronage and what that was like, which is the only way you could get ahead for those who didn't belong to the oligarchy itself. He praises, he flatters, he thanks, attends the morning levees of grandees, punctuated with thoughts of giving up and going off like a Meng Haoran. But there is a more profound critique of the empire taking shape. The best way to put it is to ask the grand question: does an emperor have the empire, or does the empire have an emperor? The question gestures are the two dominant models of imperial rule, right? There's the ideologically correct model. The emperor labors for the good of his people, takes responsibility for their well-being. That's the empire has an emperor, right? And Taizong does this theatrically in the performance of this role. That's why the middle elite liked him so much, the Zhengguan Zhengyao. From another point of view, the empire is the personal possession of the emperor. He possesses the empire in representations in the capital region by a constant stream of information. That's what the imperial courier system is for. Tribute of luxury goods representing the diversity and wealth of his territory. The emperor then distributes much of those goods to the oligarchy, where they to show them their stake in having in the empire, and then the necessity of the emperor's mediation in keeping their own position. And this is a long history. Qin Shi Huang building miniature capitals of all the states he conquered around the capital. Han Wudi bringing in the religious practitioners from all over the empire to perform all the religious ceremonies in the capital, and even with Taizong building a lotus pond so he could have Jiangnan. Lotuses don't grow very well in Chang'an, but he had to have his girls go out, his harem ladies go out and paddle around and pick lotuses to have the empire. Now, as Yin Fan excluded the nobility from the ranks of great talents and had excluded the powerful from in the ranks of his anthology, we get to see a High Tang interest in what the emperor, and by extension the great families, cannot have. Talent and recognition from having talent was Yin Fan's answer. You can't make somebody a great poet. I can do that, right? But I want to bring up a peculiar case, as minor as it might seem. The most simple thing the emperor cannot own, theoretically owns, but can't have, rather. Brings us to a famous story whose actual significance has gone unrecognized. The great Tang emperor, Da Tang Tianzi, living in Chang'an, can't have lychees. A delicious fruit, widely available where it grows, but which begins to lose its savor the moment it's picked. When Zhang Jiuling, one of the rare people who became minister who was not from a great family, wrote his Fu on the Lychee sometime between 727 and 731 in administrative exile, the poetic creation of the empire was already well underway. Zhang was, as I said, from Guangdong, praised the flavor of his local fruit, and made a prophetic suggestion. He says, unless rushed to Chang'an by the courier system, it cannot be enjoyed. This is a delicious challenge, literally delicious challenge, pitting a local fruit against imperial power and its institutional instantiation, the courier system. Which will win? And of course, the challenge is taken up in the famous story of Yang Guifei and her lychees. Yang Guifei was from Fuzhou, liked fresh lychees, and the emperor has them brought by speedy courier crushing down the farmers. An ostentatious example that the emperor says, I have the empire, rather than vice versa. We'll never know how the lychees transported by courier to Chang'an compared with the lychees freshly picked. Du Fu, who claims to have tasted Chang'an lychees and those fresh off the trees, reflected on this issue, which in a poem sequence, one of my favorite, one of the less read of them, sequence called Jieman, which I translate as getting rid of the blues. Where's my thing here? It's all about food and poetry, that which circulates in the empire and that which can't circulate in the empire, except in representation. The sequence was written early in the Dali reign, which Yale thought was the beginning of the fall from perfection of the High Tang, but Du Fu, of course, is exempted. But I think I can understand why they would say that. From the very first quatrain, we know we're in Du Fu world. I'll read it for you, the translation at least. Thatched pavilion, ramshackle gates, dwellings scattered like stars. Waves roll, the river blackens, the rain begins to fall. A mountain bird brings its chicks to feed them red berries. The girl by the creek gets a coin and leaves a white fish. Huh? Everything is local, right? The place, the weather, the moment. But there in the middle of the poem, the last line is this. 开元通宝. And 通宝 says it all. The thing of value that circulates. 通. It can be used for an exchange anywhere, including backwater Kweijo, where Du Fu was living. But the fish is fresh. However delicious, it's not going anywhere. Not even the emperor himself, no matter how much he can pay. He can afford to buy it, but he can't have it unless he comes to Kweijo. And notice that Du Fu doesn't say buy or sell here. He just reports what he sees. He sees that coin picked up, fish put down. Something of equivalence going on here. Could you think I'm overreading? I know my Du Fu. When I first read this, I didn't know exactly where it was going. Next poem would go. But I had some sense. I know the issues that were at stake. Number 2. A foreign merchant takes his leave, going downriver to Yangzhou. I recall once climbing upstairs in the old post lodge at Xiling. And why not find out for me whether rice is dear or cheap? Following my whim, this old fellow wants to go roaming east. So, here we see circulation, right? People who travel don't just sit around Kweijo. Not just any merchant, a foreign merchant. Not the visually innocent exchange made in Kweijo, coin, fish, not even called exchange, but commodity prices. If you're going down to Yangzhou, find out how the rice is and send a word message to me, and maybe I'll come join you. Du Fu is speculating on moving himself, circulating, if the price is right. Coins and portable carbohydrates are the stuff of empire. In fact, I begin to have a theory that an empire may be nothing more profound than a system of circulating excess carbohydrates. That's all it is. But in the first 2 poems, he sets his terms, focus on the local and immediate versus long-range planning, based on information, mobility, always engaged with food. Right? One's right here. It doesn't use the word buying. The other one talks about going around the empire and turns to carbohydrates. Now, this is a great sequence. I don't have time to do the whole thing, unless you want to stay here all night. Du Fu shifts to the High Tang poets, whose works circulate everywhere, like imperial coins and grain. But the poems differ because in circulating, they remember the local, and local food is always there. The representation of the local had been the prerogative of the imperial center. Here it circulates through the empire. I also recall Xiangyang's Manghara, line after line of lucid poems, all worth handing on, circulating. These days, among the gaffers, fresh phrases are no more. They merely fish by a log for the neck-contracting bram. And of course, we're back to fishing again. We start out with fishing, we come to fishing again. Fish are all the way through, except for leech, turns into lychees. And this refers to a line by Mengharan about fishing for this particular kind of bram, which they do in Shenyang. That circulates. But nowadays, the people in Shenyang don't have the poem to circulate, but they're thought of because of Mengharan's poem. The fish for dinner of the first poem returns here, as I said. They still fish in Shenyang, but their poet's gone. The one whose lines make the local fish famous. Coins and carbohydrates may link the empire together, but the poets make the particular and the local part of the whole. They're the glue that ties it together. They create empire in a different sense. The emperor can know of them, have intelligence of them, but he can never eat them. These are all the things I'd like to eat, but I can't eat. The emperor can personally possess only representations. The sequence includes, of course, with a bunch of poems on lychees, the fruit that can be fully appreciated only locally and immediately. You have to eat it right off the tree. The last poem returns to Xuanzang's abusive folly, abusing the courier system, causing local harm. To have with the emperor and his favorite can never have fresh lychees. Du Fu had passed through one of the two preeminent lychee regions on his wanderings. He had tasted the fruit fresh off the tree, and the 10th poem of the sequence, there are 12 poems, the 10th poem of the sequence says it all. I recall passing Luzhou and Rongzhou and picking lychees, half hidden among the green maples, winding off into the rocks. The ones I used to see in the capital were lacking all beautiful color. The red berry's sweetness could be known by myself alone. Only I could taste how good they were. Only the person who's been there can know. If one understands Yanyu, Du Fu's already fallen from High Tang perfection. He's making a conceptual claim rather than giving experienced poetic presence. But like Yanyu, he's thinking about the past and earlier about High Tangs. Since he gives body to Yinfan's contemptuous rejection of the urban oligarchy in the capitals. This you can't have. The talent and lychees. Poetry gave the emperor representations of the beauties of his empire, all that he possessed only in representation, discursively. He could never go there, or go there only in representation. And there's a fine little story, I didn't put this on PowerPoint, in Niu Sangru's 9th century story collection, Xu Shanguai Lu, called Ming Huang, that's Xuanzong, the emperor, in the Kaiyuan reign, visiting Guangling. Guangling is Yangzhou. It goes like this, the story, Q story. On the 18th year of the Kaiyuan reign, that is in 730, on the 15th of the first month, the Lantern Festival, the emperor addressed Taoist master Ye, saying, "The splendors of all the four quarters of my empire are displayed on this evening. Do you know which place has the ultimate beauty?" Master Ye said in response, "For the sumptuous beauty of lanterns and candles, for the display of every kind of entertainment, for the charm of gentlemen and women, infused with powder and mascara, there is no place in the empire that bests Yangzhou." The emperor said, "What technique can you permit me to go to view this?" The master replied, "Why, just your majesty. All your entourage may do so." And the emperor and his entourage, the wizard conjures up a bridge through the clouds. And the entire court goes walking over the bridge and gets to Yangzhou in about 30 minutes. It's a long, very faster than Chinese trains. And they stand up and they look down on Yangzhou. And the people in Yangzhou look up and see the emperor. And Master Ye suggests that the emperor play Skirts of Rainbow Feather Robes. That's a famous music of the immortals of the court played, which the emperor commands. Then the emperor and his party go back. It's a very fine moment. Only by magic can the emperor view the beauties of his empire, which in turn marvels at him. But you notice the uncrossable distance remains. He can only go and watch them. They can only look up and see him. He can never be there. He can just get close enough to see. He wonders if it was just an illusion. And his information network, his courier system, next week brings him news the people in Yangzhou on the night of the Lantern Festival saw the gods and immortals appearing to them in the sky. So he knows he really was there. But each can only observe the other. Right? Yingyu's High Tang was a purely poetic perfection that occurred in Chinese history but transcended it. Once we escape that aura of the High Tang, we see a moving moment that was very much part of history, a new empire of representations that included the local, a world that belonged to a new community and was shared with each locale through which they passed. There are indeed traces in the poetry. Perhaps Yinyu didn't quite get it right, with his good, I think, but somewhat imperfect intuition. They are traces that describe their negativity. There's the representations of what you really can't have. What's out of reach by belonging to a moment, to a place, and a person. Unless you can learn the pleasure of these negative traces, to accept the representations rather than to have what is represented, you're going to always be eating bad lychees. Thank you.